hey, I'm grumpy today and food has been bothering me. So I feel like ranting about food, so I'm gonna rant about food. And by the end of this, you'll see why I'm grumpy about food, but we're gonna do some background first, just sort of like, I don't know, I'm not super nutritionally qualified or anything. I have read a lot about food, but this is more like an exploration of how I think about food so that people see where I'm coming from. And it could be that stuff I say is, incomplete. I don't think any of it will be totally wrong. But yeah, food. So where do we start? Once upon a time, we're hunter-gatherers, right? We're like eating 120 grams of fiber a day, and chilling out, tons of free time, what have you. That's sort of tangential to what I want to rant about, which happens later because we start to settle down and grow crops. And when you are growing crops, you have to deal with the problem of what happens when you have a bad harvest. If there's no government intervention in farming, which, I mean, the very beginnings of agrarian society were sort of before this anyway, but let's look at slightly more modern. Let's say that there's some sort of a capitalist market and there's no government intervention in food production. So what you're going to run into quite a lot is you have a good harvest one year and farmers can't sell their harvests. People just don't need to eat that much food and there's nothing to do with it. So farmers fail to sell, the prices get driven down, so a lot of farmers go bankrupt and aren't able to run their farms the next year. And then as soon as you get a bad harvest after a good harvest, all of a sudden you have no food because the farmers aren't farming anymore. Now that's not good, so there's a fairly simple solution to this. If you see agrarian, granary. Granary is one of the words that I learned how to say by playing Civilization 2 and Civilization 1 actually when I was like 4, so I often say it wrong. But yeah, granary, simply somewhere where you store food. So if you have a really good harvest, what the government does is the government pays for the excess food. And farmers stay in business, and when there's a bad harvest, you have food stored. So it all works out, and it's much more stable. This all goes fine for like 5,000 years. The Egyptians had granaries back when they were making pyramids. And then we hit the Great Depression, and people are starting to go hungry, and food becomes a campaign issue. And FDR says that if he gets elected, he's going to ensure that Americans always have food. And man alive, was he right. So how does he do this? There's quite a lot of legislation, and I don't actually know that much about the early legislation, but it seems that the important act is the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this sort of solidifies government support for farmers in the U.S., and it does it in a new way. Rather than the government saying it will buy excess food whenever there's excess food, the government instead says that it will pay farmers to grow food. So where do we go from here? Instead of farmers, producing a reasonable amount of food and then selling it at market prices, where even if there's a really good harvest, the government is going to buy the excess at market prices. Instead of that, you get farmers just getting paid more and more money the more and more food that they grow. And this was a Canadian study that I found on Wikipedia. Who knows if it's true or not, but supposedly in 2009, farmers in the U.S. were getting 108 billion U.S. hands in aid, and that amounts to 62% of their total profit. Now that's a lot of money that the government's paying, and of course that money is coming from the taxpayers, so I'm paying for that. So what does all this mean? Okay, we have a huge corn surplus because farmers are growing more corn than people can eat. Food is a commodity which largely, not entirely, there are ways around this, and we've found ways around this, as I'm going to talk about in a bit. But food is a commodity with a fixed demand. That is to say that it's very hard to increase demand for food. Like, what are people going to do with more food? You just need a certain number of calories a day and you're set. So when you have all this huge supply, what happens? Well, there are a few things. One thing is that you send it overseas to places where either they don't have enough food, or often even places where they do have enough food, but you can sell yours to them cheaper. So if farmers are getting 60-some% of their profits from the government, that means that they only have to make 38% of their profits from actually selling the food to someone. Compare that to your average Joe in Kenya who's trying to run a farm, and he gets no money from the government, and then he harvests his food and takes it to market, and he's like, well, oh shoot, there are these American farmers who are charging a third of what I need to make to be a profitable farmer for their food. And I mean, maybe it's not quite as drastic as that, but even with all the transportation costs and everything, U.S. corn farmers are going to be able to sell their produce for much less than someone who's farming on a level playing field in another country, even with transporting the corn to that other country. And so you get into that situation that was way back at the beginning of this, the reason that we came up with Graineries to begin with, that you get a really good harvest and the farmers can't sell their food and go out of business, except instead every single year you get this artificially good harvest because the U.S. is just exporting tons and tons of corn everywhere and selling it really cheap, and farmers in other countries that just don't have the government support go out of business. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we keep giving them corn, but, well, we'll come to that later. Another thing that's sort of tangential is caloric consumption. One way that people are selling more food is just making us eat more food. You see fast food restaurants constantly increasing serving sizes. There's high fructose corn syrup, which of course is made out of corn, and it's a way to get corn into beverages and other forms of processed foods so that we have more corn in our diets and more calories as well. High fructose corn syrup sodas are extremely high in calories. I think it adds up to like 19 pounds of fat a year, like a fairly small soda every day. So there's that consequence of all this as well. And then the crux of it all, and what's really been bothering me lately, ethanol. Someone told me that ethanol was like green inspired and environmentally friendly, and we're trying to get off oil and save the planet and reduce reliance on the Middle East, and everything was all good. And like, no, not really. What's happening with ethanol is we're taking our corn surplus, and corn is not a very efficient thing to make ethanol out of. Sugarcane is much better, but we can't really grow sugarcane. But we're taking our corn surplus, because that's what we have, and turning it into ethanol, which I think we now have 10% ethanol in our gasoline, so we're putting it in our cars. And of course that's hugely profitable for corn farmers because, they have corn and then they make gasoline out of it, and you can sell gas for a lot, and the government subsidizes it even more than they were subsidizing regular corn farming. But it's awful for everybody else. It's awful for the Middle East for a couple of reasons. One is they're relying on exporting their oil for economic well-being. And the Middle East is not so popular in the US. I know. But you have to understand, people live there, and those people need to eat food and stuff like that. And not only were they relying on exporting oil to us for economic well-being and political power and leverage in the world, but they were also importing food from us, as were tons of people in Africa and other countries. And now that we're turning our corn surplus into ethanol instead of selling it to other people for food, a few things are happening. One is that US taxpayers are paying even more money for our corn, all those subsidies that we're paying for. And it used to be that people in other countries were buying the corn. That's no longer the case. Now we're the ones who are buying the ethanol that gets produced from all the corn. So that is fairly likely hurting our economy even more. And then you have all the countries that needed food, which just can't get food anymore. Food prices have gone up like 250% or something over the last 5 years. If you Google up, let's just do it. If we Google up corn prices, and we see a chart of corn prices. 2005 is when the US passed an act to subsidize ethanol production out of corn, and since then, well, there go corn prices. That's about 300%. And just recently, right on here, that's just other governments can't afford to pay that much money for food. It's happening to other foods as well, just because as the existence of as corn becomes less plentiful, you're starting to replace it with other foods, and those foods become less plentiful. It's just less supply of food, a higher price of food. We don't have enough food anymore. There are no African farmers because they got shut out of business by us. And yeah, people in the Middle East are starving. That's a large reason why all the stuff in Egypt is going on right now, because they can't afford food. And it's like, fault is maybe the wrong word, but it's a consequence of everything we've done. Our agricultural policy and economic strategy relating to food over the last 80 years is now resulting in famine all over the world, obesity all over the US. Like, what a contrast, right? We're all really fat, but other people are starving as a consequence of the same thing. And this ethanol stuff, which isn't even better than gasoline. I'm pretty sure it costs more to make, and we're paying for it, and I'm pretty sure it's worse for the environment as well. Like, the one positive is that we have a fairly limitless supply of it compared to gasoline, which we're about to run out of. But even that's not exactly true, as we're running out of usable topsoil because our agricultural policy just overworks the land so much. And as fertilizer for our agriculture comes from fossil fuels. So we're turning fossil fuels that would be used for oil into corn, which we're then processing into ethanol, which we're replacing oil with. That's my rant. I'm confused.